And what he documented and what we published a couple of years ago, I think is really remarkable and really hopeful, is that 28 of those 31 patients were able to stay on the diet for 2 weeks or longer, which is what you need to do to start to see benefits. All 28 of those patients improved substantially to the point that 43% of them achieved full clinical remission from their primary psychiatric diagnosis. And 64% of them left the hospital on less psychiatric medication. And you do not see results like this in standard inpatient psychiatric care.
Well, hey everyone, Dr. David Perlmutter here. Welcome again to the Empowering Neurologist. For the past 75 years or so, we've been messaged with this idea that psychiatric illness is a consequence of problems or imbalances of brain chemistry. And I think how we got to embrace that paradigm was through the notion that, if we can develop various drugs and pharmaceutical interventions to fix that chemistry issue, well, then problem solved, home run, right? And we've all, I think, recognized that just didn't happen. That's just not the case. The exciting news is that quite recently we're seeing the emergence of a field called metabolic psychiatry. When we begin to unpack the relationship between disturbances of our metabolism and understand the role of things like insulin resistance in paving the way for psychiatric disease, it really is A, supported by what we are seeing in the literature, and B, opens up the door to some really novel and powerfully therapeutic interventions that we are going to explore today for this big problem. I mean, there are a billion people in the world right now suffering from mental illness. 1 in 5 children and adolescents has a psychiatric situation, and it's costing us about $3 billion each and every day. So we're going to double click on this notion of metabolic issues related to psychiatric illness. Why? Because it really opens the door for some powerfully therapeutic interventions that we're going to discuss today with Dr. Georgia Ede. Dr. Ede is the author of this book that we're going to be talking about, Change Your Diet, Change Your Mind. Let me tell you a little bit more about her. Dr. Georgia Ede, she's a medical doctor, is a Harvard-trained board-certified psychiatrist based in Northampton, Massachusetts. Her interest in nutrition arose after discovering a new way of eating that reversed several bewildering health problems that she experienced in her early 40s. We so often see that to be the case. This, in her case, included things like fibromyalgia, migraines, chronic fatigue, irritable bowel syndrome. Dr. Ede acquired her bachelor's degree in biology from Carleton College and earned her MD from the University of Vermont, completing her residency in general adult psychiatry at Cambridge Hospital in 2002. After 5 years in general practice, she joined Harvard University Health Services from 2007 to 2013 as a staff psychopharmacologist and was the first psychiatrist there to offer nutrition consultation as an option to students, faculty, and staff with mental health concerns. Now, Dr. Ede devotes all of her time to nutritional psychiatry and directs her efforts on studying, writing, and speaking about the strong scientific connection between food and brain health. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. We're going to be talking about the way that psychiatry, by embracing its metabolic underpinnings, is now taking an incredible quantum leap forward. So I'm very excited to jump into our interview with Dr. Ede. Let's get to it. Welcome, Dr. Ede, to the podcast. I'm so excited to have you on today.
Thank you so much for inviting me, Dr. Perlmutter. It's a pleasure.
We were talking a little bit prior to hitting the record button, and it kind of changed how I think we're going to open up here. But I think the best place is you are a traditionally trained psychiatrist, psychopharmacologist was part of your pedigree. And suddenly you recognize that, hey, metabolism matters, food matters. So maybe you can just walk us through that change. May I call it an epiphany, or I think it's epiphany. But let's just talk about how that arose in your life. I know there were health challenges for you, but also professionally.
Yes, I think like so many of us, it really was that I accidentally stumbled into this relationship through my own health challenges. I was practicing, as you said, like most psychiatrists do, using medications and psychotherapy to try to help my patients, and I did that for 10 years, and I loved my work, and I formed really strong relationships with my patients. I learned from my patients every day. I felt challenged, but I mean, I think like many other psychiatrists, if we're being honest with ourselves, would agree, my practice was filling up with patients that weren't getting that much better, no matter how hard I tried. I used to think, well, maybe I just don't have enough experience. Maybe I need more supervision. Maybe I'm not reading enough of the right resources. When am I going to feel capable of helping most of my patients make real strides in their mental health? And so then, in my early 40s, after practicing for about 10 years, some of my own health challenges cropped up for me, things like fibromyalgia and chronic fatigue and migraines and IBS and those sorts of things, and things that many of my patients were also struggling with, and I had absolutely no idea how to help them with. And I went to all of my, local, very smart, caring Harvard specialist doctors that I had, luckily at my disposal where I was working at the time. And they all said that nothing was wrong with me. And so I was really left to my own devices to figure out what was going on. And the first thing I did just instinctively was I started experimenting with my diet. And long story short, about 6 months of trial and error, food and symptom journal, taking things out, putting them back in, trying to see what might help me. I arrived at this diet that was almost completely upside down from what we are told is healthy for us. And but that diet, that really unorthodox diet, was what resolved all of those issues that I just mentioned. But it also, and this is what really got my attention, it improved my mental health really noticeably. And I hadn't even been trying to accomplish that. I didn't even realize that I was walking around with suboptimal mental health. I think a lot of us don't realize that. So, as a psychiatrist, I thought, well, this diet seems to be good for the brain. I didn't understand why, but that was the very beginning of my study of nutrition.
You've said some really compelling, made some really compelling statements here that I just want to make sure that our audience is able to be with, and that is, you've had training in psychiatry, traditional psychiatry, second to none. You have worked with the best of the best, reading all the journals, and you realized that your patients were not getting better, and the typical response is just give them more or different medications. That's the paradigm under which I think it's fair to say most psychiatry continues to be practiced. And yet you weren't seeing success with that, and patients would just keep coming back. And what you develop, of course, in the book, and really your career at this point, is just getting the message out that, we recognize the foods we eat and our metabolic health plays a role in how we feel and our cardiovascular functionality, et cetera. But it seemed more difficult, and for many people probably still seems more difficult, to tie that whole notion into mental health, to psychiatric illness, the idea that metabolism, which is dictated by food and other lifestyle choices, relates then to what's going on in the brain, well beyond, as I said in the introduction, this notion of simply imbalanced chemistry. So after you experienced that personally, then I guess you started to incorporate that into your practice.
Well, not right away, honestly, because I didn't know anything about nutrition, and the very little that I did know about nutrition at the time, led me to believe that the diet that had helped me so much could be potentially dangerous
Oh,
for
God.
patients. And so, you know, and so being curious but also responsible, I thought, well, let me study nutrition. Let me really see if I can understand why is this diet, which is so different from what we're told is good for us. Why would this diet? Why is it that we're told that this other way of eating is so good for us? What is the evidence behind that? because I certainly don't want to go against the scientific evidence, and I don't want to harm my patients. I mean, maybe I was an exception, the fact that this happened to work for me. So I spent years, many years, 5+ years of independent study. And I took a graduate course at Harvard as well to learn more about nutrition before I started feeling more confident that it was safe and a good idea to begin incorporating these principles into my clinical work.
Wow, I'm just feeling such a heart connection right now with you because it's not easy to shift away from the bedrock of our training. And for you, the bedrock was this idea, dogma of altered brain chemistry. We'll fix it with drugs. And it probably, may I ask, how difficult was that to confront yourself and realize that you couldn't keep going down that path?
It was very difficult for me personally because it ultimately meant leaving my chosen specialty of college mental health, where I wasn't allowed in the final analysis to continue incorporating nutrition principles into my work. I was told that it was beyond my scope of practice and therefore could be potentially harmful. And so that happened both at Harvard University Health Services, where I was working at the time, and then later, so I took a job at Smith College in Western Massachusetts. And at first was allowed to use these principles in my work, but then ultimately was sort of called into the wellness director's office and the dietitian's office on campus and told that these are not safe strategies. I'm going to be triggering students to develop eating disorders. And all I was really doing in my college mental health work was trying to encourage students to, for example, avoid refined carbohydrates. I was told by the dietitian and the wellness director at Smith, for example, that everything in moderation, and we don't believe in excluding any food group. And I wasn't even trying to encourage people to try ketogenic diets in college settings. I didn't have the infrastructure support for that. I was just trying to help people learn healthier ways of eating.
Well, you mentioned ketogenic diet. For our viewers, we're going to look at that in more depth later on. Dr. Ede has done a wonderful study, and I definitely want to explore that. But I just want to get back to where we are in time with you. And I was told by my hospital that what I was doing by dealing with nutrition was not traditional. And I started to think about that term because traditional means what's been around, has the longest tradition. And, my tradition then in looking at food goes back to Hippocrates as opposed to the tradition of simply writing drugs to treat symptoms. So I know what that's like. You felt alone. Did you find any companionship or camaraderie with anybody along the way?
Not at first, but ultimately, yes. And so, I mean, I actually at first, and I still face this, even with friends and colleagues I've known for a long time who are psychiatrists, don't understand why I practice this way, don't necessarily agree with these principles, and think that they are far-fetched. But ultimately, I did find a community, and that largely thanks to Jan Ellison Bazuki and the Bazuki Group, the Bazuki Brain Research Fund, and the Metabolic Mind Project, which for people out there who might not know about this amazing philanthropic organization, if you or somebody has a mental health condition and you're curious about the cutting edge science of how to potentially recover in many cases from even very serious mental illnesses, I highly recommend that people go to the Metabolic Mind website to learn more. This is Jan Ellison Bazuki, her son, Matt Bazuki, was suffering with severe bipolar disorder with psychotic features, was on the brink of homelessness, had his college studies interrupted, and had tried 29 different medications, had been out of the hospital. And it wasn't until he met with Dr. Chris Palmer and started a ketogenic diet that he was able to set himself on the path to now complete sustained remission from very serious mental illness. So she started this organization so that other families would have access to the information and the inspiration that they need to learn more about these interventions.
Well, I would say to our viewers, you mentioned Dr. Christopher Palmer. The book is called Brain Energy, and he has appeared on this podcast. Wonderful interview. People can key that one up and watch it. Let me get back to kind of the lack of effectiveness of what you were doing. And, even to this day, I think the SSRI or serotonin reuptake inhibiting type antidepressant drugs are prescribed quite liberally. And in your book, you present information that challenges their efficacy in terms of depression, but also looks at their potential side effects. So maybe we could just take a brief moment and talk about how effective these drugs really are, what they're supposed to do, and how effective they are at accomplishing that.
Yes, so the SSRIs, these serotonin reuptake inhibitors, which, as you say, quite rightly, these are really the bread and butter of psychiatric medication practice. They are usually, in most cases, one of the first types of medicines a psychiatrist will reach for if somebody has depression or anxiety or obsessive compulsive disorder, post traumatic stress disorder, um, uh, panic disorder, variety of different conditions. And so many people are prescribed these medications, and sometimes for years or even decades. And so most people are familiar with medicines in this family. They include Prozac, the generic name fluoxetine, sertraline, which is Zoloft, Lexapro, which is escitalopram, medicines in that family.
So not real effective in terms of who's actually getting real benefit. And one would wonder if the brain is deficient in serotonin as a thesis, then a drug that inhibits the enzyme that degrades that serotonin and therefore should increase the serotonin, it should become the results should happen pretty quickly, as in days of inhibiting that enzyme. And yet, generally, even we are told by the package insert that we should wait weeks, if not months, to see the clinical benefit of these drugs. So even that tends to challenge the idea that the benefit from these drugs is actually from the fact that they're raising serotonin. So there may be other issues, other factors related to their mechanisms that may offer up some potential in terms of why they might work even minimally.
That's true. I mean, and in my experience, I mean, these medicines do help some people, but the science behind the serotonin hypothesis is extraordinarily thin to non-existent. That's been really that serotonin. The idea that the reason why people develop depression is because they don't have enough serotonin activity in the brain has largely been debunked, and so and this helps to explain why. In my psychiatric practice, I've been practicing for more than 25 years now. When I see this type of antidepressant work, it doesn't work in most people. And when it does work, it often will stop working after a period of time. And as you said, it can take a long time to work. But then even when it does work, sometimes it can stop working, or it can even turn against people and make them worse ultimately. And a lot of people, for whatever little relief they might uh, get from these medications, they pay a huge price in terms of side effects, sexual side effects, weight gain, dulling of emotions, apathy, and many others. And so I'm not sure that small benefit for the small number of people where it does help is really worth those risks.
Risk benefit ratio. But it really takes us to, I think, one of the fascinating areas of brain chemistry that intersects with metabolism, and that is serotonin metabolism. Serotonin, the biochemistry of serotonin, because it plays very much into metabolic psychiatry as we look at the impact of inflammation on the whole tryptophan, serotonin, glutamate, quinolinic acid relationship. So it takes us to then the part of our conversation where we're going to really focus on the three main pillars of what your book is about, what really I think your professional career is all about. And that is, I guess, oxidative stress, inflammation, and just basically metabolic dysfunction in general, focusing on mitochondrial dysfunction. So, well, hi everyone, Dr. David Perlmutter here. We hope you're enjoying this content, and if you would do so, go ahead and hit the like button. And if you're not already a subscriber to our channel, please consider doing so. We're really grateful to have you as part of our community, so let's get right back to the presentation. What is it about most of the types of foods that people are eating these days? Dare I say the standard American diet, the acronym SAD. But what is it about the diet most commonly consumed that is threatening to increase inflammation, oxidative stress, metabolic dysfunction, threaten our mitochondria? And then we'll get to the point of looking at how do those mechanisms then impact the brain, impact chemistry, impact neuronal function, and lead to various issues like mood disorders and even cognitive decline.
Yes, so the signature ingredients of the SAD diet that make it so much less healthy than all of the other diets that have ever come before it are this large amount of refined carbohydrate, these sort of naked carbohydrates, things like sugars and flours and cereal products, and refined fats, these factory fats, the so-called vegetable oils, things like soybean oil. So these sort of unnaturally, industrially processed ingredients, they come from whole foods, but they no longer behave like food in the human body. So when you expose your brain to large amounts of refined carbohydrate and vegetable oil, just as you said, there is this key pathway, this key regulatory pathway in the brain. It's called the kynurenine pathway, and basically this pathway helps regulate the production and activity of a number of different neurotransmitters in the brain, a number of different chemicals, many of which are also the targets of the psychiatric medicines that we prescribe. So serotonin, melatonin, dopamine, glutamate, GABA, many different neurotransmitters are affected by this pathway. But this pathway can be thrown far out of balance by these refined carbohydrates and vegetable oils, because the refined carbohydrates and vegetable oils cause inflammation and something called oxidative stress, which is why we're always told to eat more antioxidants in our diet. So the inflammation and oxidative stress throw this pathway out of balance, and many of these neurotransmitters behave differently under the influence of inflammation and oxidative stress than they do when things are more peaceful, when you're eating properly. So one of the major issues here is that so many people don't realize. I mean, yes, I was taught, for the past 75 years, we've been told that chemical imbalances are what cause mental health problems. And it's not that chemical imbalances don't play a role, they do. But what causes those chemical imbalances in the first place? And is there anything you can do about that? And I think most people don't realize that just by having the wrong information or about what a healthy diet should look like, or eating the wrong way, eating a lot of ultra processed foods, that's all it takes to cause these chemical imbalances, and quite profound chemical imbalances. And it really puts your neurotransmitters on a roller coaster for many hours afterward, and many of your hormone systems as well. So, and this is why, you're the empowering neurologist, right? Like, this is an empowering piece of information, because rather than somebody coming to me and saying, I have depression, and I say, okay, well, you must have a chemical imbalance, even though I can't test you for it and I can't prove it to you. And I can't tell you which medicine I should prescribe. So I'm going to prescribe one at a time through a trial and error process using guesswork. You can, if you have the right information, change your diet, and within days to weeks, really help start to rebalance your own brain chemistry. And I can't do that for you. That's something that you can do for yourself.
But the simplified take-home message from what you just said is that our food choices affect our brain chemistry. And to extrapolate from that, the statistics I quoted in the introduction about the global burden of mental illness affecting 1 billion people, I think it would be fair to say, maybe in your opinion, that this does reflect to some degree the global changes in nutrition that we've witnessed over the past several decades.
No question about it. So we have a global nutrition crisis. And as a result, we have a global metabolic health crisis. And as a result of that, we have a global mental health crisis. They're all related. The principles are very simple. And for those who are willing, who are curious enough and motivated enough and willing to make these changes, they're so worth your time and energy,
Mm.
even for, 6 weeks. I mean, I recommend people try for at least 6 weeks making these certain specific changes to see what's possible for them. Because, unless you try, you won't know how depressed you actually are or how clear your thinking actually could be. Because we've been feeding our brains improperly our entire lives, most of us have no idea how much better we could feel.
Hmm. This is such great information. Um, we, of the big three, then let's start with inflammation. Inflammation brought on by the types of foods that you described, also not nurturing the microbiome, and as such, gut permeability, the transgression across the blood, the leaky gut to increase inflammation throughout the body, leading to increased production of these inflammatory chemicals that affect the brain directly, but also can affect the way that, for example, serotonin is even manufactured via what we talked about earlier, this kynurenine pathway. So, how is inflammation, we'll start with that, directly threatening to our mental health?
Yes, so inflammation, which is a normal first step in it's really our first responder, the first responder of our immune system. It's the way our brains and bodies respond to any kind of a threat, whether it's infection or injury, or eating the wrong way. So inflammation in the brain, in particular, one of the things that happens, as we were talking about, is this kynurenine pathway can become unbalanced by when it's under the influence of inflammation. So you have less serotonin, less melatonin, more dopamine, less GABA. GABA is the brain's calming neurotransmitter, the brake pedal of the brain. And you have a steep spikes in glutamate, this neurotransmitter called glutamate, up to 100 times its previous baseline. And glutamate and then you can develop something called glutamate excitotoxicity. So glutamate is the brain's gas pedal. It's the brain's primary excitatory neurotransmitter. And so when you've got high levels of glutamate, and this is all just coming from inflammation and oxidative stress from eating the wrong way, when you get these big surges in glutamate, glutamate is directly physically damaging to all critical structures of the brain, including the blood-brain barrier, including the hippocampus, the brain's learning and memory center, including the delicate membranes of the mitochondria where energy is made and where so many other things happen. So all critical brain cells can suffer under the influence of too much glutamate. And this is simply from having the wrong information about what a healthy breakfast is supposed to look like. You've profoundly destabilized your brain chemistry by having that big bowl of cereal in the morning, for example.
Wow. But yet that's what we as parents were told to do based on the commercials. Start our kids off with a bowl of Frosted Flakes, right? That was enriched with something or other. Who knew? And, no wonder kids are having such issues in school. That really, targets inflammation. I think getting back to the SSRIs, though, which seems to be the default, it, there has been quite a bit of literature put out indicating that while there may not be an effect in terms of depression by the enhanced serotonin, that the SSRIs are actually to some degree anti-inflammatory, and that might explain why they have a modicum of efficacy. But in addition, one of the things seen in the laboratory is that for these antidepressants to work in rodents, and I don't know how they measure depression in rodents. I still don't get that. It's tough for me, but is because they increase neurogenesis. And I've always used this in my presentations, a slide that has sort of a teeter-totter between growth of new brain cells on the one hand, pushing down on the teeter-totter, called neurogenesis, and the offset of that, which is inflammation. Higher levels of inflammation reduce the growth of new brain cells, and that is obviously not good for cognitive function, but seems to have a role to play in depression as well. So I think we're getting to a place of really understanding that inflammation, though something obviously very important to maintain our health, over the long term, when its increase is threatening to the brain, threatening to our mental health, et cetera. The next thing that you really focus on a lot, and I know we have a graphic that we could use, is insulin sensitivity versus insulin resistance. So, why is having insulin doing its job and working effectively so important for mental health? And then for our viewers, we'll get to then what we need to do from a dietary perspective to increase how insulin works in the body and restore insulin sensitivity. But first, why is insulin and its function so important?
Yeah, so the brain does need some glucose at all times to function at its best, and glucose coming from blood sugar, of course. But the brain also needs insulin, and all of the cells inside the brain not only have glucose receptors, but they also have insulin receptors. And so the reason why the insulin receptors are there is so that insulin can attach to those receptors and give instructions to those cells about how to use glucose, to burn glucose and to use glucose to build new molecules. So, if the brain is running low on insulin, which will begin to happen if you have insulin resistance, which now the vast majority of Americans have at least now some degree of insulin resistance. If the brain becomes insulin resistant, then insulin has a harder and harder time crossing into the brain. So you can have a situation
Exactly.
where the brain can be swimming in a sea of glucose but still be slowly starving to death because of a lack of insulin, that insulin levels are not adequate. And so what's happening is very quietly and slowly, kind of insidiously in the background, long before people notice any memory problems. Their brain, the ability for the brain to use glucose for energy is dwindling. And so by the time you notice any signs, even subtle signs of memory problems, the brain can already have lost up to 25% of its glucose processing capacity. So this is happening very silently background over many, many years, decades actually, kind of paving the path, laying the groundwork for all kinds of serious mental health conditions, of course, most importantly, Alzheimer's dementia. It's a key driving force behind many cases of Alzheimer's dementia, which is just a condition in which the brain cells are dying. And this is and partly this is due to a lack of adequate energy. So it really is that the brain is energy supplies slowly being choked off.
Well, you made a very, very good and important point, and that is that these metabolic issues within the brain, in terms of glucose utilization, are happening 20, 30 years prior to the clinical manifestations of declining memory, declining executive function, really the hallmarks of early Alzheimer's disease. And, the way things are set up these days, it's sort of live your life however you want, eat these foods however you choose. And then when finally your cognitive function begins to decline, well, we have a drug for that. And, the fallacy of that approach is A, the drug doesn't work. Uh, Not that I wouldn't welcome a drug to our armamentarium. And B, it really is a manifestation of the notion of being reactive, not proactive. In other words, we're going to react to the fact that now you're cognitively slipping when the issue, as you just so wonderfully described, began 20 to 30 years before and is a consequence of the fact that, hey, there's plenty of glucose in the brain. In fact, in the early Alzheimer's situation, there's more glucose than in the control group. More glucose is just not being able to be used. It's a metabolic issue that's happening early that can be determined and fingerprinted on PET scans, fluorodeoxyglucose utilization, PET scans of the brain, 20 years, i.e., in your 30s and 40s, before you suddenly can't remember grandchildren's names and Wi-Fi codes and all those types of things, which are the harbinger for really serious problems. So, gosh, I mean, what you're talking about goes well beyond psychiatry, and it goes to neurology as if there's really a difference, and really targets the central role of metabolism. Why so much pushback? I mean, I've experienced, as you know, uh, for 25 years, pushback for the things I've been saying. Why so much? Why do you feel? what do you think is the threat that is perceived on what we're talking about?
Well, a couple of things. I mean, one is that changing carbohydrates and carbohydrates are hard to let go of, especially refined carbohydrates, sweets, and then who doesn't love sweets, right? And so the idea that these foods that we love and that we've been taught to love as even when from the time we're young children, the idea that these might be harming us, I think that's a pretty scary idea and a pretty difficult idea to swallow. And you know what I mean? And so a lot of people, of course, are very attached to these foods and don't want to give them up. But the other is that, I think we've been raised over really since the age of modern medications over the past 75 years to think of health problems, to think of the solution to health problems as medications. And for certain, it's a lot easier to take a medication, and it's more interesting in a certain way. And and some medicines work very quickly. They don't involve a lot of behavior change. They don't involve any hard work. They don't involve letting go of anything. At least on the surface, they don't. But medicines don't get to the root of the problem. They don't. They're addressing symptoms. They're trying to tamp down symptoms. They're not really addressing the disease process. And so if you really want, of course, if you want to be healthy, if you're serious about your mental health, you really do need to make some hard changes. And I know, because most of my work with patients, I mean, wouldn't it be, I would have very little to do if all I had to say to somebody was, here are the rules for healthy eating, go forth and be healthy. But most of my work is really dealing with this resistance and supporting people and encouraging them to not just try these changes, but to persist with these changes, because it's very difficult to eat a healthy diet in an environment of unhealthy foods. We live in a toxic food environment, and there's temptation everywhere. So we human beings, we don't change our behaviors lightly. So I think that's another part of the resistance. So part of it, I think, is psychological, but part of it is also the way we've been taught to think about medical conditions as being best addressed with medications.
Yeah, that's a belief issue that we have to deal with. It's a war being fought, and one of the wars I'm going to be talking about in my new book called Brain Wars. That one of the wars that is ongoing is the war of our to take advantage of our belief system, such that either we relinquish our agency over our physical and mental health to those who want us to eat those foods and take those drugs, or we become the architects of our brain's destiny by bringing on board the prefrontal cortex and making better decisions. It's tough. We are hardwired to love sweet, salt, and
Mm.
fat. Those are survival mechanisms. Fat because it's so calorie dense, salt because it keeps our blood pressure up during times of water scarcity, and sweet because it's a signaling mechanism to make fat because winter's coming. Sweet foods were in the fall and early winter, when finally the berries would ripen and we would eat them and trigger our physiology to make more fat via the fructose and uric acid, and we would survive. So we're hardwired to love those foods, and it's hard to get away from them. And yet it is our physical and mental undoing. I think there's a quote in your book that's something along the lines of, as goes the body, so goes the brain, something along those lines. And I love that because, again, it's not the brain and the mind elsewhere. It's the brain that responds to everything just like the body does in terms of metabolism. Now, I want to get back to metabolism a little bit, because metabolism is how our cells make energy, how they create molecules based upon what they are given, i.e., the nutrients that we consume. But you get deep into the function, the actual burning of the fuel, as being kind of a central issue here in the mitochondria. And I think our viewers are pretty up to speed on the mitochondria, the energy producers. We know there's a lot more going on with mitochondria than simply energy production. But I mean, here you get to the point of, this organelle, the mitochondrion, and how it's utilizing glucose and or fat or ketones to create energy. And how that ultimately is manifests as good mental health or not. And I'd like to just get to that point where, the depth of metabolism, i.e., the brain energy, Christopher Palmer kind of stuff. How do we get to that deep level of the mitochondria? And then we can back out then and look at how our lifestyle choices, specifically food, are playing in to the role of mitochondria in mental health.
Yes, so I went into a lot of detail in chapter 5 of the book, to the biochemistry of metabolism, the difference between how the brain operates when you're eating a diet that's primarily running on carbohydrate versus when you shift to a ketogenic diet and the brain is using a mixture of glucose and ketones, carbohydrate and these ketones, which are small fragments of fat. And there are many differences there that I go through, but one of the differences is that, well, let me start here. There's a neuroscientist by the name of Professor Stephen Cunnane, and he describes the brain as a hybrid engine. So a lot of people think of the brain, they think of glucose as the ideal source of fuel for the brain, and they think of ketones as just for emergencies, just as an emergency backup fuel. But that
When you're
if
starving.
when you're starving, like, or if you're, or and so, but that in ideal situation, a lot of people think that, well, the brain would just love to burn glucose all the time. That's its favorite thing to eat. But that's actually not the case. And experiments by Dr. Cunnane and others have shown this, that if you take a brain cell and you give it all the glucose it could ever want, but you also give it ketones, it will choose to burn a mixture of the two. And for a number of different reasons. And one is that ketones burn more cleanly and more efficiently and more safely than glucose does, with a lot less inflammation, a lot less oxidative stress. And so you might think, well, why does the brain need any glucose at all? Why doesn't it choose to run entirely on ketones? And the reason for that is that glucose has some advantages over ketones. Each fuel has its pros and cons. And so the brain works best on a mixture of the two. So glucose, for example, burns faster than ketones. And there are certain cells in the brain that need very fast energy. And then there are certain pathways in the brain that can't use ketones. They can only use glucose because ketones are too small. And so it's really ideal to have, you want to be burning a mixture of these fuels, and you want to be able to switch easily back and forth between them. And that's called metabolic flexibility. That's good metabolic health. That we can overnight, when we're not eating, or we're not supposed to be eating, that we're running, insulin levels are coming down, and we're starting to shift more to a higher ratio of ketones to glucose. And then when we eat the next day, if we're eating carbohydrates, which most people do, then we're shifting more to more glucose and fewer ketones. And the brain is supposed to be able to shift gears back and forth smoothly and comfortably, depending on what kinds of foods are available. But a lot of us, because we have been eating the wrong way for so long, we eat in a way where there's so much carbohydrate in our diet that our insulin levels almost never come down to a nice low point, even overnight when we're sleeping, to allow that shift to take place and to allow more ketones than glucose to be burned. And this is a very special healing state. It's a state where the cells can kind of recover and take a break and recycle and repair and do maintenance. Imagine a factory where it's running 24/7 and nobody ever has a chance to clean up or replace any parts. That's the way most of us are living, that we've got our foot on the gas pedal with glucose, glucose, glucose all the time, high insulin levels. And this is the benefit of intermittent fasting. This is the benefit of ketogenic diets. This is the benefit of exercise. This is the benefit of calorie restriction. All of those strategies do the same thing, and which is they lower your insulin levels and allow your brain and body to shift into that healing mode, and to allow repair and recycling and healing to take place.
Well, that's it. With that underpinning, you incorporate a ketogenic diet into your therapeutic protocols in treating patients. We've discussed on this podcast ketogenic diet as an interventional approach to Alzheimer's and Parkinson's with success. But you actually did a study, an interventional trial using the ketogenic diet. Can we talk about that for just a bit?
Yes. So this study, which I was a co-author on this study, was published in 2022. The clinical work was done by my friend and colleague, Dr. Albert Denat, who is a psychiatrist who's been practicing psychiatry in Toulouse, France for more than 35 years now. And he invited 31 of his most treatment-resistant patients with major depression, bipolar disorder, and schizophrenia to come into the hospital and try a mildly ketogenic whole foods diet under his supervision to see whether or not it would be helpful. And these patients were eager to do this because these were people who had been ill for an average of 10 years, some for as long as 30 years. They were taking an average of 5 psychiatric medications when they came into the hospital.
Wow.
That's not at all unusual. Not at all unusual in chronic mental illness. And they'd all been hospitalized before, one or more times, most of them under the care of this very same psychiatrist in this very same hospital setting with minimal relief. So they were eager to try this intervention. And what he documented and what we published a couple of years ago, I think is really remarkable and really hopeful, is that 28 of those 31 patients were able to stay on the diet for 2 weeks or longer, which is what you need to do to start to see benefits. All 28 of those patients improved substantially to the point that 43% of them achieved full clinical remission from their primary psychiatric diagnosis. And 64% of them left the hospital on less psychiatric medication. And you do not see results like this in standard inpatient psychiatric care.
With any medication, that's for sure. Those are
No.
remarkable results. So I think messaging then for our viewers is, we're not saying, or maybe you are, but I think that we're not saying everybody needs to go full on keto 24/7. But I think the message is that if we can improve diets to the extent that we can restore insulin sensitivity, and allow ourselves to get into ketosis, for example, each night by time restricted eating, by eating our last meal of the day earlier and not having, starting the day with a high carbohydrate meal, that we can gain some benefits that are going to have mental health benefits for us. Did I characterize that well?
This is such an important point you're making because I am convinced that many of us would not need to follow a ketogenic diet 24/7 if we had taken proper care of ourselves from early life forward. If I'd had the right information about what a healthy diet was supposed to look like, I might not need to follow a ketogenic diet now 24/7. But I am convinced that we all do need to spend some time in ketosis on a regular basis, that's very healthy and really critical for, again, sort of allowing the brain and others and body, the cells throughout the brain and body to spend some time in that healing phase. Otherwise, we're just going to accumulate damage and chronic disease over time as our cells become worn out. And so this is the foundation of healthy aging, of really taking good care of your cells. And if you have the right information, maybe you won't need to give up carbohydrates for the rest of your life. Maybe, especially if you choose the healthiest forms of carbohydrate, you could live a long and healthy life, eating a so-called balanced diet, which has a carbohydrate from fruits and vegetables in it. And that's why I didn't. That's why in my book, I have 3 different plans in the book, not just a ketogenic diet plan, because I don't believe, and I certainly haven't found this to be true in my practice, I don't believe everybody does need to follow a ketogenic diet to be well, that there are other options.
It's not a one prescription, follow this or this will fail approach. It really, and I think you metricized the diet by looking at laboratory studies to determine whatever diet a person chooses. Okay, is it working or not? And here's how we can measure that. And you put forth some laboratory studies, insulin levels, A1C, fasting glucose, et cetera. Let's walk through what are the most important laboratory studies that people can be checking to determine how close they are to adherence to a diet that's going to be good for their mental health?
Yes, so really the key here is for people to test themselves for insulin resistance. And unfortunately, if you go to your doctor and you ask for an insulin resistance test, there isn't a single test they can check off that's an insulin resistance test. I wish there were, but instead we have these indirect clues. We have these tests that are clues to insulin resistance, and you have to get several of those and kind of put them together to estimate where you stand on the insulin resistance spectrum, because insulin resistance isn't a black or white issue, it's a matter of degree. So how insulin resistant are you? And so in the book, and we'll go through it right now so people will have the information, is that some of these tests are really easy. And all of them are inexpensive and accessible to just about everybody. So, for example, a really simple one, a test for insulin resistance is free and you can do it at home, is just measure your waist circumference. And if your waist circumference is more than half your height, there's about a 90% chance that you've got insulin resistance.
So
And that's
that's
just belly
very
fat.
high tech. You need something called a tape measure. No, I've mentioned that in my lectures. That's pretty straightforward. I mean, if you're having to drill holes in your belt because it doesn't fit anymore, you're uh, you're in trouble as it relates
That's
to
right.
insulin resistance. So that's a very good point.
So that's a nice, quick, and easy one that everybody can do in the privacy of their own home. But then there are some very simple lab tests blood tests that people can do. And most of these people have already had some of these already, and they can just look back through their records and see. So, for example, usually when you go to the doctor, and they look at your metabolic health, what they're doing is they're testing you to see whether or not you already have type 2 diabetes. They're looking at your fasting blood glucose, which is when your glucose is at its very lowest point of the entire day. And that's really the last domino to fall when your metabolic health is going downhill. So that's going to be normal for a long, long time until it's not anymore. What you want to do in addition to the fasting glucose is you want to request a fasting insulin test.
So
Because,
important.
yes, so important, because you want to know not just, okay, is your glucose normal? If it is normal, how much insulin are you having to pump out of your pancreas to keep that glucose normal? And over the years, if you're eating the wrong way, too many of the wrong carbohydrates too often, for example, or just overeating in general, that you'll need more and more and more insulin to keep that glucose in a healthy range until it just can't do it anymore. So the fasting insulin is really important. And another really great test that everyone's already had multiple times is the fasting lipid profile. And so if you look at the triglycerides on your lipid profile, and everybody tells you to look at the LDL cholesterol. It's not that the LDL doesn't matter. It's just that it's the least important number, the least useful number on your
Yeah.
panel. It's really look at the triglycerides. If the triglycerides are over 100 milligrams per deciliter, or over 1.1 millimole if you're outside the United States, then that's a clue that you're eating too much carbohydrate for your personal metabolism.
So this is personalized medicine. This isn't, this gives you a sense as to what you are doing, what works for your genetics, your physiology, and takes into account, I guess, or is reflective of your earlier life choices as it relates to insulin functionality.
Yes, exactly. The triglycerides are really just fat in the blood, and you can eat a zero fat diet and still have high triglycerides, because when you're eating more carbohydrate than you can use right away with exercise or store in these small storage systems we have in our body, we can't store very much carbohydrate in our bodies, and whatever we can't use or store right away, the body turns into fat to tuck it away for a rainy day, and that's the triglycerides. And so if you're eating more carbohydrate than you need, the triglycerides will be high. You can bring these numbers down. You can bring your fasting glucose down. You can bring your fasting insulin down. You can bring your fasting triglycerides down within a matter of days to weeks if you have the right information. So you can really turn the Titanic around pretty quickly.
So when people look at this information and they take it to their healthcare provider and say, "I want a fasting insulin level," and that was a lab I had recommended in Grain Brain back in
Yes.
2012. And the objection from my colleagues was, what are you looking for, insulinomas or tumors that secrete insulin? And I tried to walk through the fact that, yes, the blood sugar is going to be normal while the pancreas starts to work overtime by secreting higher and higher levels of insulin until finally you get to the point of prediabetes or frank type 2 diabetes. But there was pushback, and I don't know, maybe there still is pushback in terms of checking the insulin level, but I sure agree with you. That is a really important study. Along with, I still think there's some utility of looking at the A1C, and
Yes.
I think you talk about that as well. Why would that be something we should pay attention to?
Yeah, I completely agree with you. The hemoglobin A1C is an estimate of is a reflection of your average blood sugar over the past 3 months. And so the hemoglobin A1C, that can still be normal in people with insulin resistance, but it's less likely to be normal in people with insulin resistance. It gradually climbs, of course, because what you're missing with the fasting blood glucose is you're missing these peaks that can happen after meals. And so if you're getting these peaks after meals, that's really one of the first clues to metabolic dysfunction, or to the clue that you're eating the wrong way. It'll all come back down to normal by the next morning, and until you've got type 2 diabetes. But the so-called postprandial glucose spikes, those are what most people are missing when they're just looking at their fasting glucose. But the hemoglobin A1C will pick those up. So if your glucose is running too high throughout the day in between meals, and nobody's checking that, then that can cause you to have a higher hemoglobin A1C. And of course, these days, one of the most wonderful tools we have available to most people, if they can afford them, is even a single continuous glucose monitor worn for 2 weeks. You can get them for $40, $50 now in the United States, even without a prescription, which is wonderful. You can see in real time what's going on with your glucose patterns. And I have yet to meet a patient who wears a continuous glucose monitor and doesn't change their diet.
Mm. Including yours truly. I had to give up cashews. I found that cashews in David Perlmutter tended to spike my glucose incredibly. And so I used to enjoy cashews.
My condolences.
They're substitute, believe me. I will say there was a little surprise from me at the level of pushback on nuts and seeds. You
I
which
know.
and so let's just talk about that for just a moment. You were pretty down on nuts and seeds in terms of anti-nutrients. Talk to us about that, because I think a lot of people gravitate towards, now that we're talking about cashews, gravitate towards nuts and seeds.
Yes, and so I have a chapter in the book about grains, beans, nuts, and seeds, and explaining the pros and cons of those foods. And I'm particularly bullish on the grains. I think there really isn't any need, unless you have no other choice, to include grains in the diet, which is interesting, right? Because that's what we're told should form the foundation of our diet, should be whole grains,
Whole grain goodness.
whole grain goodness. I'm particularly would really advise everybody to avoid grains. The legumes, I think, are really important, especially good sources of amino acids, especially for people who prefer to follow plant-based diets. So those can serve a really important role in the diet, but they need to be prepared in a way that can, make them safer and more nutritious, and soaking and boiling and that sort of thing. The nuts and seeds are interesting because they're not. Most of them, they don't contain the same level of vicious toxins that the other seed foods do. And I kind of hypothesize about that in the book. Why might they be gentler? Why might they be safer for us to eat than grains and beans, which are similar foods? They're all seeds. All of these are seeds. They have little embryos inside. They have a lot in common. But nuts and seeds are, for the most part, gentler on our systems in terms of the way they protect themselves from predators. And this may be because, particularly in the case of nuts, the tree needs moving creatures like human beings and animals to transport their seeds to help them spread. And so they certainly don't want to kill off their transportation system. So I think that they're for people who tolerate them well and digest them well, they're really wonderful sources of amino acids and healthy fats, and they're really convenient, and they're really, for the most part, with perhaps the exception of cashews and a couple others, really great choices for a ketogenic diet as well. So, but the reason why I call people's attention to them in the book is because many of my patients, and I'm not seeing the average person, I'm seeing people usually who have a lot more difficulty in terms of their health. They often don't realize that sometimes these could be working against them. And so I want them to keep that in mind. If they have, for example, chronic constipation, or if they have irritable bowel symptoms, and those types of things. So I want people to know that these foods do have some risks, and that for each person, they're going to need to evaluate their pros and cons. I used to do very well with nuts for most of my life and enjoyed them. And then at a certain point, for whatever reason, I lost my ability to tolerate them. But again, if we take really good care of ourselves, we should and may be able to tolerate those plant foods for our entire lives quite well. But I think that as we've lived in this more toxic environment over time, our natural defenses have started to break down,
Mm.
particularly our gut barrier and our immune system. We no longer, lots of us are losing our ability to tolerate foods that we should be able to tolerate, that we evolved alongside and should be able
Very,
to
very
tolerate.
good point. Because of how we've threatened our microbiome, that should be shoring up the integrity of the gut lining, and therefore we can't tolerate exactly those foods that we theoretically should have, save some genetic issue, for example. So you're right. There seems to be a tendency for people these days to want to gravitate to so-called superfoods. And you call it out in the book. You call out the notion, this moniker of a food being a superfood that, as long as you're eating this powder each day, then, everything else sort of falls into place. So, again, I think you get back to the idea that no, that doesn't seem to be where we should be going. And I do want to say that for our viewers, that what you describe in your book is not challenging. It's not restrictive. That's the word I'm looking for. That you really are open to a variety of dietary perspectives, provided they accomplish the very basic tasks of helping us improve our insulin sensitivity, reduce inflammation, help us with oxidative stress, and nurture the microbiome. So you're very open to a variety of dietary approaches or desires on the part of the reader, so that it makes it very user friendly. And you've got so many great recipes in here, so it really it opens the door. And with that said, I want to thank you for your time. This was everything I wanted it to be. It's such great information.
I'm so truly, I'm honored that you invited me, Dr. Perlmutter, and I said this to you before we started the interview, is that, it was many years ago, and it may have been 15 or more years ago. You were the first physician that I ever heard make that connection between blood sugar regulation and brain health. And I'll never forget the day that I was listening to a podcast while I was driving in my car, and it something clicked for me, and I thought, okay, metabolic health doesn't stop at the neckline. It's of course it doesn't. Why would it? But until someone says it out loud, you don't necessarily think about it that way. And so I really thank you
You
um,
bet.
for inviting me and for helping to inspire me to follow this line of work.
Well, and thank you as well. I will indicate that 20 years ago they weren't called podcasts back then, because it was probably on a cassette tape. It was probably Functional Medicine Update with Dr. Bland 20 years ago. But anyway, thank you again. And this is such important information. And my hope is, this is the Empowering Neurologist podcast. My hope is that this information is empowering for people who need help, who are finding that, going from one prescription to the next, which is so commonplace these days, is just not working for them. And I think back of the times in my office when I would see 6 and 7-year-old kids coming in on more than one psychotropic medication, and really wondering about the idea there needs to be a better way.
Hope is on the menu.
Yeah, focus on the menu. I like that. All right. Well, all the best. And again, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you very much as well. Take care, everybody.
Empowering information. This notion that we should be relying on the next great drug as it relates to psychiatric issues, even as it relates to cognitive decline, is sort of a message that we get from those who may benefit from our utilization of those medications. And hey, I'm all in as it relates to an effective medication, but here we see that these illnesses that we talked about today have a very strong metabolic underpinning. And when we pay attention to that and redirect our metabolic health through the types of interventions that we talked about on the podcast today, we can expect to see some significant improvements without concern with respect to things like side effects. Hope you enjoyed the program. I'm Dr. David Perlmutter. Thank you all for joining us today, and we will be back soon. Bye for now.